We're going to be discussing about the presentation we just had about technology for the growth. We're going to be working on... Yeah. So this is the structure. We're going to do a brief summary of the article we were given, and then we're going to be addressing a couple of critiques, and then some questions as to stimulate debate. First of all, this was the article, Beyond Global versus Local, Illuminated Cosmolocal Framework by Vasilis Kostakis, by Vasilis Niaros and Chris Giotistas. This is basically a paper. It's going to be centered about the Tzoumakers project that we learned. It's an action research paper. It takes convivial technology development framework, and the cosmolocalism is rather important for the paper and for the paper. And the cosmolocalism is an issue of socio-technical configuration, describing agglomeration of commons-based technology and product-oriented. So it's like a way to reverse the issue of scale, where we just learned about how the local and the global communicate and interact with each other in order to also surpass this dichotomy. And the paper is based on interpretivism, interviews, and workshops. And we already learned about the Tzoumakers. Where was it geographically located in Greece? And it's an open lab for communities to cooperatively design. And it has a quite interesting makerspace to solve common local needs with global connections. Yeah, we already learned about the region Tzoumaker and Greece. The project and Tzoumakers is based on the needs of the local community that's focused on small scale and low intensity activities such as agriculture. The article has three main axes of reflection about technology and degrowth, which is the matter of degrowth per se, but also the matter of scale and space, and the issue of commons and conviviality and autonomy. For the second, for the matter of issue and space, we found rather interesting how the interconnection of Tzoumakers had not only in the region, as we learned through the exposition, but also in a bigger scale, including both rural and urban projects. And in that sense, we found another reading quite interesting about degrowth and the city and the effects that degrowth has in space. And space considered not as a geometrical plane, but as a sphere that is produced by social relations. And thus, material degrowth has consequences in space, both quantitative and qualitative. Degrowth and epistemic material violence. And this article specifically warns us about the local trap of falling and to romanticize too much local projects and to avoid the dichotomies of space, such as rural and urban and local and global. Yeah, those the need of rethinking space, which falls rather in order with cosmolocalism. And lastly, the article also covers the need for degrowth based on this for aspects of it: conviviality, design, localization, and sense of belonging by the project of Tzoumakers, which also relates to a bigger picture of degrowth principles. And lastly, the article also poses different challenges and tensions and lessons. Some of them were already been discussing throughout the presentation. Challenges being the digital design, the issue of designing, and then the issue of the licensing and copywriting, as well as the makerspaces that they face sort of a legal gray area. The tensions between standard imposition and coming back to these dichotomies, and include the issue of inclusiveness and injustice versus functionality and effectiveness, and the use of material energy and material intensive infrastructure such as the internet or other services. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the challenges and tensions mentioned here, and it's mainly about the makerspace labor and legal security, and also the tensions about inclusiveness and justice among the communities that the makerspace operate in. But it's also going to be a little bit about the social aspects, because we know, I mean, very well in the heterodox circles, that any discussion or any initiative about degrowth also has to be about the social aspects of it. So my critique is a little social aspects of the Tzoumakers community. So are the critiques, I mean, my critique is really about, are the peers in a precarious space? So I'm going to just read out this particular section from the paper that we analyzed. It says that makerspace often operate in a gray area regarding labor and legal security, and there are no standardized protocols for makerspaces regarding organizing safe and effective manufacturing workshops that focus on a needs-based design approach. Moreover, the makerspace guide space organize workshops under questionable conditions concerning the participants' security and their legal involvement in non-for-profit or for-profit initiatives, because their participation may not necessarily be foreseen. And so this raises a lot of questions about the lack of organized space of the Tzoumakers community. So are the contributors or the workers really as safe? Then the degree of inclusivity, which was essentially a little bit tackled by the video that we saw about the Habibi Works community. But are the women and LGBTQ community members really given the necessary onboarding into these communities to contribute to these initiatives and also benefit from the innovation of the commons? And are there any functioning methods to ensure that patriarchal patterns do not really persist in these communities? And also, are there, most importantly, are there any measures to protect the innovation from being appropriated by capitalists, given that there is a gray area in the functioning of the makerspace? So the obvious solution is to standardize the functioning of makerspace. But then what would standardizing actually look like? Is it going to be cooperatives, which are still capitalist? Is it going to be open cooperatives, which are going to be a blend of capitalist and commons logic ethos? Or is it just going to be commons, but they still need to generate money to be able to interact and exchange with the capitalist economies? So how would also the standardizing impact the degree of inclusiveness in the community, given that it's already a point of tension, whether there has to be inclusiveness or there has to be efficiency? There's also a lot of literature already before establishing these communities about that there is a degree of precariousness on the functioning of commons-based peer production models. So Standing 2014 states that there is a direct correlation between the rise of precarious freelance workers and also the emergence of digital open source networks. Two main members, Bowens and Niaros from the P2P Lab, also say in their ETUI policy brief that commons-based peer production models allow employers and capital to deploy workers more precariously, engage in cost-cutting methods, while also externalizing the risk of entrepreneurship to the workers. So this implies that commons-based production models eventually kind of settle into the nooks and crannies of capitalist thriving system that we currently have. So commons-based peer production models, can they really be compared to a big platform capitalist economy with different tasks being given to agricultural production communities or to energy production communities, essentially? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the debate with the PPL and GPL licensing method. So licensing is considered that it's the best way to protect against the capitalist appropriation of the commons creative knowledge. But the peer production license, which is essentially a type of license that allows only members of the commons and cooperatives and non-profits to share and reuse the materials, but not commercial entities that intend on making profits without explicit reciprocity. This means that capitalists who do not contribute back to the commons pay a rent to access the knowledge. This allows that the commercial exploitation of the creative knowledge of the commons happens only by the communities that essentially are cooperatives and distribute the profits among the members equally. But there is a critique about GPL being a better suited license for the commons knowledge. Rigi 2014 says that the general public license is a better alternative for licensing commons, because any software that's developed from knowledge of from any software that's licensed under the GPL, and any community that kind of develops on that knowledge also has to share that particular derivative under the GPL. And a particular example that he gives of it is that IBM, the company that tried to use the GPL-based Linux model, also had to convert their own proprietary software into commons. So essentially, he argues that GPL is better suited, and it also makes it possible to extract commons out of capitalism. So essentially, I would like to conclude my point that a lack of standards and legal measures, even with a commons logic, can still be precarious and serve the capitalists, despite the ethos of creating a united political front and the ethos of solidarity, community, and revolution.
Thank you, Chitnain. So how does this work? So my critique is focusing on the theory of change and the assessment of incumbent structures within the set article, but also in the broader literature. So when you think about change, you first need to think about the object of change. What are you trying to change? And in the article, you have all these different quotations that kind of define this object. But as you can see, it's a rather structural and systemic understanding, but vague nonetheless. And it sort of begs the question, what is it specifically that we're trying to change? And what are the parts and vulnerabilities of the system that are going to lead to change and hopefully cumulative and systemic change? And then in the article, you also have a sort of explanation of what this transformative process is going to be. And it's about scaling wide rather than scaling up in a hierarchical way, having a diverse ecosystem that provides a diverging and independent alternative to the capitalist mode of production. And also provides and develops a certain political vision for institutional and political unity. And it's all sort of encapsulated in the notion of cosmolocalism. However, developing a vision, being autonomous, providing an alternative, although extremely important, it's not the same as undoing, replacing, or transforming the incumbent structures within the socio-technical systems that we live in. And so this is kind of the crux of my critique. So the authors in the paper do recognize that cosmological production is sort of experimental, and it's more of a vision for the future rather than a silver bullet to all the problems we ever had in humanity. But nevertheless, for me, degrowth, and sort of by definition with a prefix D, is all about undoing, replacing, and subverting the capitalist structures that exist or that pre-exist any transformative effort. And so the transformative potential of commons-based peer production depends on how it addresses these incumbent structures. And speaking of incumbent structures, now I'm going to turn to the broader literature and specifically the chapter by Pazaitis and Dressler. And they show how a lot of commons-based peer production projects are actually dependent on welfare and social policies from the state, and we see in the article that indeed a lot of the P2P Lab projects and the projects you mentioned during your presentation do indeed depend on government funding, support, and infrastructure. And for the authors of this chapter, this means that there needs to be some kind of governing and regulating institution for a global scale of commons-based peer production, and they call this the partner state through a sort of Hegelian sense of what the state is. And they argue that open cooperatives should be the structural institutions for such a counter-hegemonic movement. Now, I don't have the time to go into the details about Hegel, but there is an issue of not problematizing the state, and there's a lot of literature about the structural coupling of economic growth with interstate competition and geopolitical security interests. There's also the famous sociological definition of the state as the monopoly on violence, and also the fact that welfare states are often in the global north dependent on the exploitation and appropriation from the periphery and the global south. So this begs the question, is the state an agent or a barrier to change? Obviously, it's probably a bit more complex than that and dialectical, but we need to acknowledge that there are structural barriers and resistance from incumbent structures and actors. And now to turn to the sort of the how transformation is supposed to happen. We saw what it was like in the article, and now the broader literature works from the premise that the economy is multimodal, so you don't have one mode of production. And changing this economy is all about asserting a new configuration in the relation between these different modes. And you do this through ideological struggle rather than a frontal assault on state power. And this ideological struggle is through prefigurative politics, which means reflecting the future society you desire through your actions and practices. And this can be done within the interstices of the existing system. And then to sort of create a political subjectivity that is capable of rearranging the economy, you need a historical bloc and alliances with all other kinds of movements. Now, the limitations of this theory of change, to me, are that although ideological change is important, and obviously it's related to the mode of production through commons-based paper production, the mechanisms of systemic change are more complex than just diffusion and creating new alternatives. Prefigurative politics faces material limits and resistances within incumbent socio-technical systems, like the state, for example. And then it also begs the question of how much space there really is for prefigurative politics to grow and develop into a counter-hegemonic bloc. The interstices and the margins of the capitalist system are limited, and the examples from Greece actually have been studied by Vavarousis in 2020, and he shows, where he explores empirically how these commons-based peer production projects proliferated and reproduced, and he argues that it's all about actually a response to the great societal crisis and upheaval that there was in Greece after 2008. And so it kind of implies that the commons-based paper production only has space to proliferate and reproduce as a response to crisis. But obviously, we'd hope that we'd find a solution before it's too late and the climate crisis becomes catastrophic for all of us. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then the risk of not acknowledging and not thinking about transformation in this way is that we might fall into the same traps as all the movements that have pre-existed but shared similar ideologies and ideas as the commons peer production movement, where capitalism rejuvenates and reproduces itself by co-opting and integrating them within itself. And the risk is that proponents of commons-based peer production then become a recursive public, what defined as a public only interested in reproducing the conditions of its own existence, and then not looking really further beyond that at continuing to confront the structural inequalities and power asymmetries globally. And so I would argue that even in the broader literature about commons-based peer production, our critique stands that strategically developing new ideologies and practices is very important, but as well as alliances, obviously, but we need to develop ways to actively engage and undo existing structures. And therefore, analytically, it's key to understand the vulnerabilities and strengths of the targeted socio-technical system and how they may be exploited or transformed. And these are our questions based on our presentation. Thank you.